Wow, that interview with Mr. Cosner was pretty great. It was a very interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy. We actually continued talking for like another 30 minutes after that. And, but anyway, I hope you enjoy. Hey, everybody, this is Elvis and my chemistry teacher, Mr. Cosner.
Hello, everyone.
Is there anything you would like to say by way of intro to just to introduce yourself? Like, how long have you been teaching and stuff like that?
Sure. I'm actually a Burroughs High School graduate back in 2002, and I got my degree at Cal State Los Angeles and majored in biology with an emphasis in biochemistry, minor in music of operatic performance.
That's cool.
Came back and started teaching at my alma mater, and was originally planning on going towards a medical master's,
Oh yeah,
but fell in love with teaching while I was applying to grad schools and haven't looked back since.
nice. So, was there any point like in the process of your educational career that you thought maybe you wanted to be a teacher?
Actually, I wanted to be a doctor since I can remember, so I kind of put blinders on and hadn't thought about almost any other career
Oh, that's cool.
since. But I started teaching for a teacher who went out on medical leave for a long-term sub, and the rapport and the ability to communicate with the students and the conversations we got to have in class
Oh, yeah.
were so inspiring that I couldn't see myself doing anything else afterward.
That's cool. Doing what you love. That's
Find
what it's
a
all about.
job you love, you never work a day in your life, right?
Yeah, it's true. Um, to get into teaching more specifically, how do you, from my perspective, it seems like there's almost kind of a creative, like an experimental nature to teaching. Why don't you explain?
I would wholeheartedly agree. It's funny, I was actually just thinking about that the other day, that there's a not insubstantial part of my day I try to devote to tinkering with things, kind of going online and seeing what other people are doing, looking at other ways to observe the phenomenon that we're learning in class, either things we've just done or things we're getting ready to do, or sometimes when I'm in the shower, like an idea will just hit me of like, this is a better way of doing it. And so it's kind of bittersweet, especially when it's the lesson we're doing that day, because then I realize I have to rush into school and go fix everything because I feel like I can't do it a less good way.
Yeah.
So I have to recraft the whole lesson on this better way of doing it. And so it's kind of this mixture of inspiration and self-torture, because I want to be the best teacher in the universe. So every time I find a better way to do something, I want to do it that way instead of the old way that I used to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you kind of have a good time doing it. Whether you're jumping up on the table and flashing the lights off and explaining the projector.
And that's one of the things that I try to. There's also a performing aspect to teaching that I think the more well-rounded an individual is, the more engaging they are as a teacher in the classroom. If you have someone that's just really knowledgeable about their field of expertise, but they're very dry and unengaging, the students tune out, no matter how intelligent the individual is. And no matter how entertaining the individual is, if they don't know what they're talking about, the students also tune out. And so there's got to be this hybridization between ability to engage and be interesting, but also be knowledgeable and applicable in the field that you're doing. I think that's why teaching is such a challenging field, because you not only have to be able to be surprised by what the students' insights might be and be ready for that, but also be willing to interact with them where they are.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's weird how anything that you can kind of approach with a creative, like a creative challenge or a creative standpoint, or even like a competitive nature, it just becomes more engaging. Like I've probably learned more this year than I have in every other year. Even though it's been my hardest year, like tough classes, I've still uh, probably learned a lot more things. Even in just my elective, that class has been pretty crazy.
Which one are you doing?
POE with Mr. J.
Yeah, he's a great teacher also, but engineering is such a fantastic field, and it's a perfect example of applied sciences.
Yeah.
I think we often forget, like you had said, just how much in the simple things you learn what you didn't know about it.
Yeah. Like um, if this project we're doing right now, for example, is the ballistic device where we have to shoot a golf ball. And when I first heard of that, I thought, man, this sounds cool. I want to try to figure out something really unique. And since it was something like that, I worked on it harder than I would on most things because it's something that I thought sounded cool. Like, probably spent most of spring break working on it.
I was just talking with somebody about figuring out what people want to major in, and almost all studies across the board show it's better to do something that's harder and you're more interested in than something that's easier that you're not interested in. A lot of people take courses, for example, because they think, oh, this is going to be an easy class, and then end up not doing well because there's such a lack of engagement. And even though things can be very challenging, I think my class is a good example. People tend not to fail my class because it's challenging. People tend to fail my class because they choose not to engage.
Yeah.
And I find that that's a trap in a lot of people's courses and course choices. Is it almost always comes down to a level of commitment. And as a teacher, you're always trying to figure out, how do I gain that trust and that commitment with the students that this is something worth investing in? And the golf ball trebuchet is a perfect example of, wow, this is interesting and fun. I get to throw things.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the balance that you want to find something that you think is worth committing to, but sometimes that might be a challenge because it might be something that could be ridiculous. Like to some people, like majoring in music is obviously, it's a bit of a challenge. Like
I would agree.
for me, I want to major in music, but I'm not sure. So I want to take a year off and go to Missouri, go to what are those schools where they teach you stuff like
A
plumbing?
trade school?
Yeah, and I'm gonna do that and get a part-time job and just focus on music for a year and kind of dip my toes in.
I would highly recommend that as a great pursuit if you want to do it. I think there's two different traps that people fall into. One trap is people go into a field that they like, not necessarily they love, because they're interested in it, like music, and then find that they don't have a career that they're willing to pursue to the end. I realize the reason why I have a music minor rather than a music major, a lot of people asked, I spent much of my time in the music department because I loved it, and they asked me, why aren't you a music major? Why aren't you a theater arts major? Because you're doing all of these performances. And I said, because I want a job after I'm done. and I say that kind of in tongue in cheek, and not that there are no jobs in that venue, but I realize the choice you have to make going into those venues is sometimes marrying your career. You can be a performer and you can be a musician, you can be these things, but whenever you make a choice, you have to give up something else. And often in those fields, not always, but often, family is one of the things that you have to give up, because you have to move a lot, you have to be really flexible, and the income, at the beginning at least, tends to be sparse. And
Yeah.
so I realized family was more important to me than pursuing music. And so to me, I knew I wanted to go into a science field because I love science like I love music, but there was a stability that I sought after. So in some ways, a trade school would be a great way to have that duality.
Yeah.
Just because you're doing a trade doesn't mean you can't also do something you love. And there's not, I think sadly, a lot of people feel that a four-year degree is the only way to pursue success, where there are many people who work in professions that are hands-on, in mechanics and welding and machining and plumbing and anything you could name, that have long, illustrious, fulfilling careers. And in some sense, that's a part of them, but it may not define them, because while they may do that and they may enjoy it, they also enjoy something like music or theater arts or some other pursuit that they're doing. often when you can wed the two, the guy who's an auto mechanic who also rebuilds cars in his spare
Yeah.
time is the classic example of someone who has turned their love into also their work. In some ways, my teaching profession is like that. I love science and analytical thought and understanding how the world works, and I've got to make it into something that I get to share with other people whom I learn to love.
You said something about analytical thought, and that reminds me about how you're always talking about how that's where you're often leaning to in teaching. Why don't you kind of explain yourself there?
Sure, I feel the individual skills that teachers are often trying to develop in students are sometimes less applicable in any specific area the student may go into. A lot of students may not need to use Avogadro's number very often later. They may not need to be able to convert from moles to mass and back again. However, the ability to recognize how pieces are related and meaningfully move between one and the other to solve a larger problem is a very important skill that almost any major thought-provoking career is going to go into. In fact, one of the most applicable master's programs one could think of would be something called systems engineering, which is the concept that you're figuring out how to integrate parts so that they function together better. And that can be anything from a management position, trying to integrate all the departments of a larger business, to integrating systems to make an aircraft function from electrical to mechanical to the operational. And so there's this broad spectrum of kind of analytical thought embedded in figuring out how things work together. And so all of the things I'm always trying to come back to in the things that we are learning is your ability to be able to do that, to look at new information, to process what it means, and then derive, what do I do with this now? Kind of each thing we go to, each new concept we come to, it's kind of a new chance to get to hone that skill.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that concept, like, because if you're someone who's able to kind of figure things out, and you just don't have a bunch of stuff memorized, then you are more likely to be able to, solve problems.
Exactly, be successful in whatever venue you want to go to. And on the flip side of that, there's also a base level of knowledge that I think is attributed. I realize I haven't waived the ability to know certain things, because there are things that I just expect everyone to learn. Being able to read the periodic table of periodic table of elements, and know which ones are metals and non-metals, and electronegative and less electronegative, and gain and lose electrons. And in some ways, I just take it for granted that you will know these things once I ask you to do them, because then you don't get to do the higher level thinking if you don't know the basic vocab. And I often draw the analogy in a foreign language. If you don't know the words, you can't talk to me. And so if you don't learn the basic concepts, we don't get to have the higher level conversations about why things work the way they do.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought about that. Being a teacher, it seems like it's very challenging trying to figure out, because if you're a teacher, you're obviously good at the thing you teach. So it's kind of hard to imagine what people are and aren't good at.
Exactly, and that I think that's the conundrum of many teachers go into teaching because they've loved academics, and they often have the hardest time connecting with those who do not. And so there's that terrible dichotomy that gets created of almost this war between those who do and don't love learning and academics and study and bettering oneself, when in actuality it can instead be transformed into cultivating a love for it and helping people see what they can like and they can do. I think what inadvertently happens when somebody is not good at something, that gets reinforced by those around them, and they get pushed away from something rather than a person looking at it in that we merely need to cultivate this in you more so that you can see what you do enjoy and how it's embedded in what you find. The way that's been refreshed to me is just this year, a young lady reminded me in saying that she's not always, her words, not mine, or that she's not always the best in this class, but it's the class that she looks forward to coming to the most. And that reminds me that we as teachers have to balance rewarding students for not only doing well, but not forgetting to appreciate students for being who they are. And there's that constant balance between specific reward for jobs well done, but also being able to appreciate all of them as human beings. Because whether or not they do well in the class, you want them to be able to have the nourishment and sustenance and support of a mentor to be able to succeed and not quash their ability to succeed in another endeavor, even if it's not in the specific one you're working with them in.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to the things we said earlier in a lot of ways.
Very much so. The kind of full circle of what drew me to the field in the very beginning. It's exactly right. And I think similarly, being a physician, I was interested in pursuing that field for similar reasons. The science and cognitive part of it and problem-solving nature, but also the interpersonal and being able to serve others in a meaningful capacity. I think that's what also drew me to education. In some ways, the pediatrics I was originally looking to move toward would have served me less in the capacity that I realized I love so much about teaching, because it would have been mostly infants. But I realized the group that I really love working with is the young adults, people who are in their late adolescence, who you can have a meaningful intellectual rapport with, but are still budding enough and interested enough and realize how much they still need to know about the world. Yeah. And so there's this perfect hybridization of being able to communicate with them and them still having appreciation for what they still need to learn.
Yeah. That also kind of reminds me of, I think about like kind of how you're always outside shaking people's hands. You're such a nice guy that over 90% of the people, I'd say, probably love you.
That warms my heart to hear, because I know some people are afraid of the L word, but I feel that never once have I looked back and thought, man, I wish I didn't tell that person that I loved them. And how often there are books written about if we had only said that more. And I realize I try to be effusive with my compassion and my appreciation and my love for my students, because so many horror stories have come to my realization of sometimes I might be the only one. But I don't want to just take care of that one person. I really come to love all of my students, and every year I'm always surprised as the year comes to the end how you can go from not knowing someone to, by the end of the year, having a deep love and appreciation and this fatherly mentor relationship with so many. And I always fear that because I love all of my students, that students don't recognize that the love I have for them is not painted with a broad brush, but it is a deep personal love for each one of them, as well as my compassion as a teacher. But I also feel that I try to get to know my students as an individual, who they are and what they care about, and that I care about the things they do.
Yeah. That's it seems like just from going to school all these years that students try to get more engaged into their classes depending on how much they respect the teacher. So if they usually respect teachers that they respect them as a person, so they don't want to disappoint them.
I would wholeheartedly agree. And even when you don't win that battle in the moment, either in a day or a month or even within that year with that student, I feel that kind of the seed is planted. Not everyone has the opportunity to talk with their students after the fact, but being in a small town, I've had the opportunity to have several interactions with people that surprised me. My very first year teaching, I was a much less good teacher than I am now, and I think back at all the mistakes that I made and all the things I wish I could do better. There was one young man in particular who I was very hard on, and he was difficult most days, but I didn't cut him a lot of slack, and I really required a lot of him, and he was very smart, but very, very disruptive, and it was a challenge as my first year. 6 or so years later, I run into his older brother and end up working with him in another capacity, and he mentions me, and then I run into the young man again, and he shared with me how grateful he was to have me as a teacher. And I could have sworn this young man hated my guts
Yeah.
because I was so hard on him, and he was such a pill for me. It was so hard for me to go day by day to try to work with his kids. But I realized he knew everything I did was out of wanting to make his life better. And that warmed my soul more than I can say to realize how blessed I was that even through all of my errors, this young man was able to recognize that I was doing it for the right reasons for him, not just to be a jerk. And that you guys remind me of that every day, that even when I mess up, even when you guys mess up, that doesn't destroy our relationship with one another. And I think you're right. It does give us a lot of a place to build upon, to do an endeavor together, and you don't want to disappoint me. And there's, on the other side of the spectrum, there's a young man who shared with me how hard it was for him to hear my reminding him that he wasn't doing what he said he would, and yet he continued not to do it. But what I hope is there are people I know in high school that didn't do well, even though there are people who cared about them, who are now incredible individuals, but they just weren't quite ready yet. And I think as teachers, we need to not forget that even though he may not be ready this year to have done that and be ready to really commit, hopefully this experience will prepare him for that time when he is ready, that he'll be able to do great things.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of that whole thing you just said is. It kind of reminds me that you even when you regret something, it's kind of bittersweet that you regret the things you did, but the fact that you regret it makes you think that, at least I'm learning. Like, at least I'm learning from my mistakes and thinking about stuff and growing as a person.
Very much so. And in teaching, one of the big things that they remark is one of the most powerful tools available to a teacher is to not only teach the students to reflect upon their mistakes, but as a professional to constantly reflect on how you did and what you could do better and what you would do differently. One of the phrases in behavioral management is, don't worry, if you mess up, the student will give you another opportunity to get it right next time. Because they'll, just like us, you guys are never going to be perfectly behaved, and so we'll constantly have the opportunity to learn and be better in each day. And I think just as we hope the students will recognize a mistake does not define us, I think we have to be careful as teachers to not allow mistakes to define students, and give them the opportunity to grow past individual mistakes and even repeated mistakes, and to recognize the difference between a cognizant choice and making a mistake. And that is a difficult subjective thing rather than an objective measurement, but I think is a really important facet of teaching nonetheless.
Okay, this is something that might be a little controversial.
Okay.
Where do you stand on the idea that, anyone can be really good at anything and stuff like that?
I would agree with you that it is very controversial. Oddly enough, Ratatouille had a really great ending to the movie, and I think it really captured in a beautiful way that our perception of anyone doing anything, I think, is a misconception, is that he said that not everyone necessarily is a good cook, but a good cook could be anybody. And I really liked that way to capture that. It didn't belittle the ability of those that did not cook very well, but it allowed us to be susceptible to the people who we didn't expect to do something very well. There are many skill sets that I don't have. I am a very mechanical learner. I really enjoy dance, and I really enjoy music, but neither of them are incredibly intuitive with me. The emotional projection is something that I tend to do well with, and the vocal manipulation in theater I tend to do well with, but the actual musical and dance facets and rhythm and timing and note specificity are something that I learned very mathematically
Oh yeah.
and not very intuitively. So I have to work really hard for that. Where there are certain people who kind of just effuse music; it just comes out of them,
Oh yeah.
and they're able just to beautifully do it. And they can't necessarily tell you why or tell you what they did, but it is just amazing to watch. And so I think it would be an insult to say that I can do what they do, because I think it would belittle the true
Yeah.
power and beauty and talent that they have. However, I think it would also belittle me to say I could never create what they create, because through hard work and diligence and sacrifice, there are moments where I can do a piece as beautifully as that person did it intuitively. But I would have to be willing to put in the time and sacrifice the other things I could have been doing instead to be able to do that. And I think that's truly the conundrum we run into, is that it takes certain people longer and more effort to produce the exact same thing, for which some people could do with great ease. And I think we think it's an on-off switch rather than a spectrum of capability. And I think it is willfully ignorant of us to recognize that the spectrum spans from those who can hardly take care of themselves in the day-to-day task in special environments for learning, to those who skip high school and start college as 12 years old. And they're, as I said, I think is willfully ignorant to recognize that there's not everybody all across that spectrum from one end to the other. So why should we be surprised when people have one level of capability compared to another, and not recognize it for where it is, that if they want to do it, they could, but how much would they have to sacrifice and give up to be able to do that? So we should realize that we can hold people where they are and hold them accountable for higher standards, but recognize they can only do it through great work and sacrifice if
Yeah.
it doesn't come easily.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it in a better way. Like, people, if they don't enjoy something as much, or if it doesn't come as well to them, they're gonna have to put that much effort in it. But then at the same time, they're not gonna be able to concentrate on it as much. So it's different things are very challenging. But I do agree with the fact that eventually you could probably do almost
Absolutely, and
everything.
it just depends. There was a beautiful quote at the end of this wonderful violin recital. This man played pieces from joy-filled and spiritually uplifting to leaving the audience in tears, and he made it look easy. One of the great things about beautiful performers particularly is their ability to make it look effortless.
Yeah.
And a woman in the audience in a Q&A session afterwards said, I would give anything to play like that. And the man turned to her and said, I did. And I realize we forget that to be a level of greatness, there is sacrifice. What are all of the things that person didn't do in order to become great in that endeavor? And so I had a young man last year in AP chemistry that transferred out, and I was asking him, why? You have an A in this class. Why don't you stay in? Why are you transferring down a level? And he said, because I'm spending 5 hours a night on the material. And so to him, it demonstrated that a brilliant young man could not spare to donate the time that he had to in order to continue working at that level in that particular course. And so I find it sad, both from a parent's perspective and from a teacher's perspective, when we don't realize how different we are, and then everyone is going to do everything at the same time. And so the young man that had to spend 5 hours on the AP to get an A, then had to spend half an hour on chemistry a night to get an A. And we don't recognize that that's an important distinction, that he's not less intelligent for having made that choice, but it was a meaningful choice for what he needed to do. And I think all the way from parents to administrators to teachers don't recognize that that choice has to be incredibly individual. And the parents are there to help make that choice, not cram kids in a box that they don't fit in very well.
Yeah.
You know, when a kid is taking 6 honors classes and has to spend 11 hours on homework a day, that may not be the right fit, not because he's not hardworking and not because they're not intelligent, but because the amount of time they have to commit to those. Perhaps there are courses where they would enjoy more and have to work less so that they could do a greater diversity of things.
Yeah. Wow, that's yeah, it's true. I wonder I've wondered a lot about how do all the teachers do they talk about all this stuff that we're talking about right now?
That's a great question. And for years, they've often referred to teachers as kind of being individual rulers of their kingdom in their classroom because the uh, transferring a class in semester or quarter, you could have a completely different grade with completely different curriculum and a completely different experience from one teacher to another, and it be the same course at the same school. But one of the huge movements across the nation, specifically with Common Core, is to try to help make that more equitable. When you take a class from a teacher at an institution, they've communicated to a degree where you will not get a different level of education. You will merely get a slightly different experience because the person teaching it, not because the curriculum is different. That's the goal. That's not always the case, but I think education has made a turn to move toward that model and away from the model of your level of education is left to the ability of the instructor in the classroom, rather than saying, let's have all of our teachers who teach the same thing work together so that all students have the best experience possible and only changes by the teacher they're with. And you probably know from your experiences, if you've moved from one class to another during a semester,
Yeah.
that that's probably not always the case. There are probably teachers who you take that everyone talks about that, oh, take them because they're the easy teacher, or take them if you really want to learn something, or take this person if only if you're really good at writing because they're really grade challengingly, or take this class, it's way more fun. They do the same thing, it's just more fun.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that happens a lot.
And the it's more anecdotal to do it via conversation, but that doesn't mean it's any less true. It's just harder to gather statistical evidence on something like that. That's almost more qualitative and ephemeral in its composition.
Wow. Well, that being said, and this is not as serious, would you ever start your own podcast where you interview the other teachers like Mr. Smith and Mr. J?
I hadn't thought about it. Oftentimes, I find myself, you're asking about these conversations in particular, not all teachers are interested in this. I am one who happens to be very interested in doing my job better. And I haven't necessarily thought of doing podcasts before, though I am probably one of the more technophilic of teachers, integrating the uses of our technological wherewithal into academics. But I think recording the conversations that I've had with them would not be without merit. The one thing that I fear is the amount of data that goes on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
I just heard a quote that said, "Never had so many with so little to say said so much."
Oh, wait, what? Can you say?
So many with so little to say said so much.
Oh.
And so kind of the prolificness of podcasts and blogs sometimes makes you wonder how much of it is really worth listening to and seeing. But I think conversations like this
Yeah,
are
I'd listen
incredibly
to it.
meaningful and worthwhile. And this has inspired me to recognize the value of recording some of those conversations.
Yeah. Is it just like talking to someone in like a format that you normally would not? You might be able to get maybe even you might be able to hit more bounds on a conversation.
Very much so, and then use that as a talking point to stir other conversations elsewhere. I think some of the things that you would ask were incredibly insightful, particularly the one that struck home with me was your conversation about students' capabilities of being able to do everything. That's something that's been close to my heart, because I fear that we choose to look away from things that we can't fix directly, and that makes us unable to deal with them realistically. And I think having conversations like this could institute changes and solutions that as individuals we don't know the answer to, but as a collective we might be able to find meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, I think this has been pretty good. I have one more question.
Fire away.
What would you say if I got them to put this on the borough's homepage?
I would be perfectly fine with me, and I hope that if anything I said was of value to others, that they would make use of it, and that I feel as a professional, both in the classroom and outside, I love when I'm able to serve in some capacity.
That's cool. Well,
Oh, sorry. I just had one question as well. Is it frustrating to see students who you have in your class just go by with like a C minus and don't want to do any better than that?
That is a yes. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that I understand that sense of perspective, and part of our job, while I wish I didn't have to be a cheerleader, is in some capacities to inspire greatness in others when they don't have the intrinsic motivation themselves. And you're not going to get to do it with everybody, and you're not going to help everyone get an A. But it is really almost painful to watch when you see a student from a range of grades voice to you specifically, oh, I brought that up to a D, perfect, that's what I needed for my next progress report, and stop working.
okay.
Or you see the person who could be getting an A turn in enough work to get a C because that'll get their parents off their back. Or the student who gets an F in the class when if they did anything would get a C. And so you have that whole range from F to A to be able to demonstrate. Most students don't work at their full potential. Many do, but I would say maybe I'm wrong to say most. There's an unfortunate number of students that don't work at their full capacity, and it is hard as a teacher who loves the students, and in fact as just as people, it's hard to watch people we love make what we know are bad choices. And since I love you guys, when I watch the students in my classroom choose to take certain actions, it's hard on me because I want them to want what I want for them. And that is, but it's also understandable having been in your shoes. It was a while ago, but I remember high school, and I remember making the cognizant decision of I could do this and get this grade, or I could work at this level and do all of these other things that I'm working on. And sometimes that is what life is also about. Sometimes you don't get to do everything in life to the full capacity you want to. Sometimes you have to give and take and sacrifice. So I also understand it in that capacity. Oftentimes it's the most painful when it's for what seem to be insubstantial reasons. Entertainment, video games, Facebook, whatever it is. But oftentimes it's much more understandable when you recognize a person's circumstances are that they are taking care of their family or working for their family or doing sports and service organizations and church groups and all of these other things so that there isn't enough time in the day to do everything. Then it becomes much easier as a teacher. And those students tend to be in a very different category than the ones that kind of just wash their hands of the work once they've gotten what they, quote, need to get, end quote.
Yeah, because I just have a friend who is like very, very intelligent, but he has D's and C's in every class just because he doesn't want to try.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a mixture of things. Sometimes it's due to classically boredom. There's some kids that just, they could do the tests in their sleep and they could do certain things and they just don't need to work hard so they don't have to. And so there's a lack of engagement, what you were talking about earlier, Elvis. But sometimes it's because, and some students will admit to it, that they just don't want to. That there's something else they would rather do. One of my best friends from high school loves education now, and he realizes how valuable it is intrinsically, but he remembered not waiting till he could get home to start up his Super Nintendo. And that's what he wanted to go do instead. I don't know what that particular young man is doing, but I know it's hard on mentors when they see them able to do so much more and so intelligent and so capable, not earn a rating that adequately depicts their capability. And you don't, as a teacher, want to just give it to them because then it enables that behavior. And so I used to be a teacher that thought, I just want to make a class 100% tests. That's it. If you do 100% tests, you get an A on it, you're done. And I realize as I mature that there are tests that check for that level of knowledge, and we call them AP tests and SATs and ACTs and MCATs and everything that you go into in any specialty field, but that the grade is perhaps supposed to be a mixture of forming a person to get them ready to be part of society. And part of that is you're willing to buy in and work and become a part of a process and engage. And so more and more recognize the need for a facet of the grade to be, what is that person able to produce as a part of a portfolio for a class rather than just a tested academic knowledge. And so while that is sad to see that person do it, I think also it's not unreasonable for that person to have low grades to communicate with others what this person is, so that when person sees a 2400 on an SAT and sees in a class, what they see is, oh, this is a person who's incredibly intelligent, but doesn't always follow through. And so that communicates important knowledge to people, I think.
That was a good question.
Thanks.
But yeah, that was Mr. Cosner, and at the end it was Daniel.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, it was a great pleasure. Thanks for being on this recording.
Anytime. I'll look forward to an invite back if you have the opportunity.
All right. Well, I'll see you later.